The grey Chicago sky weighed on Gerald Vance's shoulders like a lead blanket. His footsteps echoed emptily on the sidewalk as he walked with no apparent destination, hands tucked in the pockets of his expensive coat that no longer brought him the same comfort as before. At 57, his face marked by deep wrinkles carried the weight of memories he preferred to keep locked away. The city around him pulsed with its usual frantic routine, impatient horns, fragmented conversations of hurried pedestrians, the creaking of buses at stops. But to Gerald, everything sounded distant, as if he were submerged in deep waters. His feet carried him along a path he had avoided for years, a route that awakened ghosts he fought daily to keep dormant. That's when his eyes captured a scene that made him stop abruptly. Sitting on the cold sidewalk, a small girl hugged her knees. Her dark, disheveled hair framed a childish face marked by dried tears. In her small, dirty hands, she held a crumpled piece of paper with the word "birthday" written in shaky handwriting. Gerald felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. He tried to ignore it, to continue, on his way as he did every day when faced with the hundreds of scenes of misery that the big city provided. But his feet refused to move. "What's your name?" The question escaped his lips before he could contain it. The girl looked up, revealing honey-colored irises that seemed to carry a sadness too great for her age. "Claire," she answered in a low voice, almost a whisper. "How old are you, Claire?" "6, she replied, pressing the paper even tighter against her chest. "Today is my birthday," she added, and her voice trembled slightly. But nobody remembered. Those words hit Gerald like a punch to the stomach. Images he kept locked in the back of his mind began to emerge. An untouched birthday cake, empty chairs, broken promises. He shook his head, trying to push away the memories. "Where's your mother?" he asked, looking around as if expecting some responsible adult to appear at any moment. "She went looking for work," Claire answered, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her worn shirt. "A long time ago." Gerald felt his heart tighten. Years of business experience had taught him to read between the lines, to detect half-truths, and something in the way that child spoke screamed that there was much more behind that simple story. "Are you hungry?" The words came out automatically, surprising even himself. Claire nodded timidly, and Gerald found himself doing something he never would have imagined, offering help to a stranger. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "I know a place nearby where they serve really good hot chocolate." The girl hesitated, years of warnings about not talking to strangers evident in her distrustful gaze. But there was something in that serious man's countenance that conveyed a security she hadn't felt in weeks. As they walked to the nearest cafe, Gerald felt his private world trembling at its foundations. For years he had lived in a self-imposed cocoon, taking refuge in his solitude like someone hiding under a blanket during a storm. Since the accident, since he had lost, no, he couldn't think about that now. At the cafe, he observed in silence as Claire devoured a cheese roll and drank her hot chocolate with a voracity that betrayed long periods without a proper meal. Her clothes, although dirty, were of good quality, another detail that didn't fit in that puzzle. "Where do you live, Claire?" The girl lowered her eyes to the empty cup, a heavy silence settling between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was just a thread. "I don't know anymore." Those 3 words carried a weight that Gerald knew all too well, the weight of loss, abandonment, loneliness. Against all reason, against all the walls he had built over the years, he felt something awaken in his chest, a protective instinct he thought dead and buried. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Claire shook her head, and Gerald saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. Without thinking twice, he grabbed a napkin and handed it to her, watching as the girl held it with trembling fingers. "I have an apartment not far from here," he said, surprised by his own words. "It's too big for just one person. There's a guest room that's never used." Claire's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear dancing in her honey-colored irises. Gerald knew he was doing something crazy. He knew there would be consequences, that his carefully controlled life was about to collapse. But for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something right. "Just for today," he added, more to himself than to her. "Tomorrow, we'll look for proper help." As he paid the bill and stood up, Gerald had no way of knowing that just for today would be the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. He had no way of predicting that small, frightened girl, found by chance on a cold Chicago sidewalk, would be the key to unearthing not only his deepest pains, but also his long-forgotten capacity to feel, to care, to live. The sun was beginning to set when they left the cafe, tinting the sky in orange tones that seemed to promise a different tomorrow. Gerald held Claire's small hand, feeling her warmth penetrate the layers of ice he had built around his heart. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something beyond emptiness: hope. Gerald's apartment, located in one of Chicago's most upscale neighborhoods, was a perfect reflection of his life in recent years, impeccably organized, coldly decorated, and completely devoid of human warmth. The gray walls seemed to absorb any attempt at joy, and the expensive furniture, chosen more for status than comfort, remained untouched like museum pieces. When the door opened, Claire hesitated at the threshold, her eyes surveying the environment, with a mixture of admiration and fear. Gerald realized for the first time how intimidating his home might seem to a child. The shadows of early evening projected through the corners, creating mysterious shapes that made the girl grip his hand even tighter. "You can come in," he said, trying to soften his naturally deep voice. "You're safe here." Claire's small footsteps echoed on the marble floor as she timidly entered the apartment. Her dirty clothes and worn shoes created a stark contrast with the impeccable decor. Gerald felt a pang of shame as he realized how much money he had spent to create a space that, in the end, only served to amplify his loneliness. "Do you live here alone?" Claire's innocent question cut through the silence like a precise arrow. "Yes," he answered, his throat tightening slightly. "For a long time." As he guided the girl down the hallway toward the guest room, Gerald passed a door that always remained closed. His eyes lingered for a second on the doorknob, and unwanted memories began to sprout in his mind. Childish laughter, the sound of footsteps running down the corridor, a sweet voice calling, "Dad." "This will be your room," he announced quickly, opening the guest room door and turning on the light. The room, like the rest of the apartment, was elegant but impersonal. A king-size bed occupied the center of the space, with Egyptian cotton sheets that had never been used. Claire looked at the huge bed with wide eyes. "Can I really sleep here?" "Of course," answered Gerald, realizing too late that he had no suitable clothes for her to sleep in. "Wait a moment." He went to his room and rummaged through the drawers until he found an old t-shirt that, although still enormous for her, could serve as a nightgown. When he returned, he found Claire standing exactly where he had left her, as if afraid to move, and break something. "Take a bath first," he suggested, showing her the adjacent bathroom. "There are clean towels in the cabinet." While the girl bathed, Gerald remained seated on the edge of his own bed, head in his hands, trying to process the madness he was committing. The sound of running water brought up more memories that he struggled to keep submerged. Sunday afternoons preparing the bath, choosing the ideal temperature, checking if all the favorite toys were there. A muffled sob from the bathroom yanked him from his thoughts. He jumped up, his heart racing. "Claire, is everything okay?" "Yes," came the trembling response. "It's just that it's been a while since I've had a hot bath." Those simple words hit Gerald like a punch to the stomach. How many days had that child spent on the streets? Where was her family? What had happened to leave her in that situation? When Claire finally emerged from the bathroom wearing his t-shirt that looked more like a dress, Gerald felt something break inside him. She seemed even smaller and more fragile, her wet hair framing a face that, now clean, revealed delicate features and cheeks slightly flushed from the hot bath. "Are you hungry?" he asked, realizing that the afternoon snack had probably not been enough for someone who clearly hadn't been eating properly for days. Claire nodded timidly, and Gerald headed to the kitchen, another room he rarely used. He opened the refrigerator and found only a few basic items. His solitary life didn't require much more than that. He managed to prepare a sandwich and heat a glass of milk, watching in silence as the girl ate while sitting on the high stool at the American-style kitchen counter. "Tomorrow," he said more to himself than to her, "we'll sort out your situation." But when bedtime came and Claire was already settled in the huge bed in the guest room, Gerald realized that sorting out the situation wouldn't be as simple as he had imagined. The girl refused to talk about her family or her address, changing the subject or simply closing into a stubborn silence whenever he tried to touch on the matter. Lying in his own bed, Gerald spent hours awake, tossing restlessly among the sheets. The silence of the apartment, once his only companion, now seemed different, filled by the small presence sleeping in the next room. His thoughts constantly led him to that closed door in the hallway, to the room that remained untouched for years, preserved as a sanctuary of a life that no longer existed. Suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the night's silence. Gerald jumped up, his heart racing. He ran to the guest room and found Claire sitting on the bed, shaking, tears streaming down her face. "It was just a nightmare," he whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed, not quite sure how to comfort a frightened child. His arms remained rigid at his sides, while a battle raged within him between the instinct to hug her and the fear of allowing such closeness. "She said she'd come back," Claire sobbed, her voice choked. "My mom said she'd come back." Gerald felt his heart tighten. Slowly, like someone unlearning years of emotional distance, he extended his hand and touched the girl's shoulder. The contact, although hesitant, seemed to calm her a little. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked softly. But Claire just shook her head, wiping away tears with the backs of her hands. Gerald remained there, seated on the edge of the bed, until her breathing calmed and her eyes began to grow heavy again. When he was sure she had fallen back asleep, he rose silently. Standing at the door, observing the small form curled up among the expensive sheets, Gerald felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the weight of responsibility for another life. And for the first time in a long time, this weight didn't seem unbearable. The night advanced slowly, and the shadows of the apartment seemed to dance with the secrets those walls now kept. Gerald knew he was getting involved in something much bigger than a simple good deed. He knew he should have called the authorities immediately, that having an unknown child in his house could bring serious consequences. But when he returned to his bed, he realized he couldn't simply hand Claire over to some institution the next morning. There was something about that girl, in her silent sadness and her resigned strength, that touched wounds he thought were healed. Sleep, when it finally came, brought confused dreams filled with childish laughter, broken promises, and unexpected second chances. And for the first time in years, Gerald didn't wake in the middle of the night, haunted by nightmares from the past. The first rays of morning sun found Gerald already awake, seated in his Italian leather armchair, eyes fixed on the awakening city beyond the window. He hadn't slept more than a few fragmented hours, his mind a whirlwind of concerns and questions. The soft sound of small footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Claire appeared at the living room door, still wearing his improvised nightgown t-shirt, her hair tousled from sleep. There was something different in her gaze this morning, a glimmer of expectation mixed with fear, as if she feared that everything was just a dream from which she would wake at any moment. "Good morning," she said timidly, her small hands playing with the hem of the shirt. "Good morning," replied Gerald, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he had exchanged these simple words with someone in his own home. "Did you sleep well? After the—" "Yes," she interrupted him quickly, clearly not wanting to talk about the previous night's nightmare. Gerald got up, feeling every muscle in his body protest after the poorly slept night. "Let's have breakfast," he suggested, heading to the kitchen. Once again, the precariousness of his pantry embarrassed him. He managed to find some eggs, bread, and orange juice. While preparing the most elaborate breakfast his kitchen had seen in years, Gerald observed Claire from the corner of his eye. The girl had settled again on the high stool, her bare feet dangling in the air, watching his every move with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You know how to cook," she commented, sounding surprised. "Not really," he replied, turning. the eggs in the frying pan. Just the basics. My mum, Claire began, but her voice failed. Gerald waited, keeping himself busy with breakfast preparation, giving her space to continue if she wanted. She used to make pancakes on Sundays. The simplicity of the shared memory hit Gerald with unexpected force. His own daughter also loved pancakes. It was one of the few things he knew how to prepare well, a Sunday ritual that— "Here you go," he said abruptly, placing a plate with eggs and toast in front of Claire, interrupting the dangerous line of his thoughts. As they ate, in silence, Gerald tried to organize his next steps. He needed to go to the office. He was president of one of the country's largest construction companies. He couldn't simply disappear. But what would he do with Claire? "I need to work today," he began cautiously, observing her reaction. The immediate panic that crossed the girl's face made his heart ache. "Are you going to send me away?" The question came out as a frightened whisper. "No," he replied, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "But we need to find a solution. Can't you tell me where you live, where your mother is?" Claire lowered her eyes to her plate, now almost empty. "She went to look for work," she repeated the same story from the day before. "Oscar said she'd come back." "Who is Oscar?" "Her boyfriend," replied Claire, her voice becoming even lower. "He took me to school one day and said he'd pick me up later, but he didn't come back." Gerald felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. What kind of person abandoned a child like that? "How long ago was that?" "I don't know," she shrugged, but her eyes began to fill with tears. "Many days. The school closed and I didn't know where to go." The story began to form in Gerald's mind, each piece fitting together to form a devastating picture. A missing mother, a negligent stepfather, a child left to her own devices. His instinct told him to call the police immediately, but something held him back. Years of business experience had taught him that official solutions weren't always the best. "Do you remember your home address?" Claire shook her head negatively. "It was a green building," was all she offered. Gerald sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He picked up his cell phone and started dialing his secretary's number, but stopped midway through the process. How would he explain this situation? What would he say? "I'll work from home today," he finally decided, to Claire's evident relief. "But we need to establish some rules, okay?" The girl nodded solemnly, sitting up straighter on the stool. "First, you can't leave the apartment alone. Second, if someone knocks on the door or the phone rings, don't answer. And third," he hesitated, realizing the absurdity of the situation he found himself in. "Third, we need to buy you some clothes." Claire's eyes widened at the last part. "New clothes?" "Yes," he replied, already thinking about how to resolve this without drawing attention. "You can't keep wearing my old t-shirt forever." After breakfast, Gerald improvised an office in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table while he conducted video conferences and responded to emails. Claire remained quiet on the couch, watching him work with silent fascination. During a break between meetings, he found her napping, curled up among the expensive cushions that before served only as decoration. The sight hit him with unexpected force. How long had it been since his house had sheltered something so innocent and vulnerable? His cell phone vibrated with a message from his secretary, reminding him of an important board meeting scheduled for the next day. Reality was beginning to press against the walls of the small world they had created over the last 24 hours. Gerald knew he couldn't maintain this situation for long. Sooner or later, questions would begin to be asked. But as he watched Claire sleep, he realized that for the first time in years he felt truly needed. Not as the president of a company, not as a public figure, but as a human being. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when Claire woke up, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Sorry," she muttered, seeming embarrassed for having slept. "No need to apologize," he replied, closing his laptop. "You must be tired." "I haven't slept much these days," she admitted, and once again Gerald felt his heart tighten at the thought of that child alone on the streets. "We'll sort this out," he promised, more to himself than to her. "But for now, how about we order a pizza for dinner?" The smile that lit up Claire's face was like a ray of sunshine breaking through the heavy clouds that had hung over that apartment for years. And for the first time since he'd found her, Gerald allowed himself to smile back. Days began to unfold in an unlikely routine in Gerald's apartment. A week had passed since he'd found Claire, and each morning brought with it new challenges and concerns. The wardrobe in the guest room now housed some childish pieces, discreetly purchased through a trusted personal assistant. The kitchen drawers, previously almost empty, began to fill with snacks and treats appropriate for a 6-year-old child. But not all moments were ones of apparent normality. During the nights, Claire's nightmares continued, her screams echoing through the corridors of the apartment, bringing to the surface memories that Gerald struggled to keep buried. On one of these particularly difficult nights, while trying to calm the girl after another traumatic episode, she finally began to open up. "We used to live in a nice place before," she whispered, curled up against the pillow. There were flowers in the window. But after Oscar arrived, everything changed. Gerald, seated on the edge of the bed as had become customary, listened attentively. His heart beat rapidly, fearing and at the same time yearning for more information that might help understand and perhaps resolve Claire's situation. "Your mother, did she change when she met Oscar?" Claire nodded, her small fingers clutching the blanket. "She started crying a lot and he shouted so much." Her voice failed and tears began to stream down her face. Gerald felt a wave of anger grow in his chest. How many times had that child witnessed scenes of violence? How much fear had she kept inside herself? "One day," she continued, her voice almost a whisper, "Mom said she was going to look for a better job, that she would get us out of there, but she didn't come back. And then Oscar..." She stopped, trembling. "He left you at school," completed Gerald, remembering what she had told him before. "He said he'd pick me up after class. I waited a long time. The teacher stayed with me until late, but then she had to leave. She said she would call someone to help me, but..." Claire swallowed hard. "I was scared. I ran away before she came back." The silence that followed weighed like lead. Gerald tried to process everything he had heard, his brain working furiously to connect the pieces of that painful puzzle. "Why did you run away, Claire?" The girl took time to respond, as if carefully choosing her words. "Oscar said that if I talked to anyone, if I asked for help, he would hurt my mom." Gerald closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that revelation. A 6-year-old child carrying such a heavy burden, such a great fear. How could someone be so cruel? "How long were you on the streets?" "I don't know," she replied, her hand still clutching the blanket. "Many days. I slept in different places. Sometimes people would give me food, but I never talked much. I was afraid they would find out." The businessman felt his heart break a little more. He thought of all the cold nights Chicago had faced. In recent weeks, of all the dangers that lurked in the city streets. How had that child survived? "And why did you talk to me?" he asked softly, suddenly realizing that this was a crucial question. Claire looked up at him, those honey-colored irises shining with contained tears. "Because you looked sad, like me." The simplicity of that answer hit Gerald like a punch to the stomach. He who had built so many barriers around himself, who had isolated himself from the world after his own tragedy, had been read like an open book by a 6-year-old child. "You won't send me away, will you?" The question came laden with fear. "No," he answered firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "I won't send you away." But even as he made that promise, Gerald knew he was getting increasingly involved in a potentially explosive situation. He was sheltering a missing minor without documents, without legal authorization. If someone found out, as if responding to his dark thoughts, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his secretary. "Mr. Vance, the board is concerned about your sudden withdrawal. They are demanding an in-person meeting for tomorrow." Gerald felt his stomach sink. He had managed to run the company from home during the last week, but he knew he couldn't continue like this indefinitely. He was president of one of the country's largest construction companies. People depended on his decisions. Projects needed his approval. He looked at Claire, who had finally begun to fall asleep again, her features softening as sleep enveloped her. How could he leave her alone? How could he trust someone to take care of her without raising suspicions? But there was something even more disturbing haunting his thoughts. What if Claire's mother really was in danger? What if Oscar wasn't just a negligent stepfather, but something much worse? The weight of the responsibility he had assumed began to make itself felt with full force. It wasn't just a matter of sheltering a lost child. He was potentially involved in something much larger, much more dangerous. The night advanced and Gerald remained there, seated on the edge of the bed, observing Claire's restless sleep. Outside, the city continued its frantic rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding in that luxury apartment. And somewhere, a mother was missing, a dangerous man remained free, and time was running against them. When he finally stood up to go to his own room, Gerald knew he had reached a point of no return. He could no longer pretend this was a temporary situation. He needed to do something, but what? His gaze fell on the closed door in the hallway, the one that kept so many painful memories. Perhaps it was time to face his own ghosts in order to help Claire with hers. Morning arrived with an inevitable decision. Gerald needed to go to the office. After a night practically without sleep, he prepared an elaborate breakfast for Claire, trying to compensate for what he was about to do. The girl, seated in her usual place at the kitchen counter, sensed that something was different. "You're going out," she said. It wasn't a question. "I need to go to the office today," he replied, placing a stack of pancakes in front of her. "But I'll be back soon." Claire's eyes instantly filled with tears, although she fought bravely to contain them. "What if you don't come back? Like my mom?" The question hit Gerald like a punch to the stomach. "I will come back," he promised, his voice firmer than he felt. "I have a trusted person who will stay with you." In fact, this had been his biggest concern during the sleepless night. After much consideration, he had called Mrs. Zelda, his former housekeeper, who had retired a few years ago. She was a discreet lady who had worked for his family for decades, including before the accident. The sound of the doorbell made Claire visibly shrink. Gerald placed a gentle hand on her shoulder before going to answer the door. Mrs. Zelda was exactly as he remembered. Always well-groomed grey hair, erect posture despite her age, and that look that seemed to see through people. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Claire, but she didn't ask questions, one of the reasons why Gerald had always trusted her. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she said simply, as if it were completely normal to be urgently called to care for a mysterious child. The hours that followed were a test for Gerald's nerves. The board meeting dragged on interminably, with questions about his recent absence being raised more and more directly. "Is everything okay, Gerald?" asked Albert, one of the oldest board members, during a break. "You seem different." "I'm fine," he replied dryly, checking his cell phone for the 10th time. No message from Mrs. Zelda, which he tried to convince himself was a good sign. But it was during the last presentation of the day that his world began to crumble. One of the directors was showing slides about new developments when a news report on the silent TV in the meeting room caught his attention. "Police investigate. Disappearance of woman and child in Wicker Park neighborhood." Gerald's heart stopped for a moment. The photo that appeared on the screen showed a young woman, about 30 years old, with the same honey-colored eyes as Claire. "Excuse me," he muttered, getting up abruptly and leaving the room, leaving confused looks behind. In the hallway, with trembling hands, he turned up the volume on his cell phone to watch the report. The story was exactly what he feared. Darlene Stevens, 33, had disappeared about a month ago, along with her 6-year-old daughter, Claire. The police suspected the involvement of the woman's companion, Oscar Mendoza, who was also missing. Gerald felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Now he knew Claire's full name, her mother's, the man who had abandoned them. The situation had just become much more real and much more dangerous. His cell phone vibrated, a message from Mrs. Zelda. "She's restless, asks every 5 minutes if you're coming back." Without thinking twice, Gerald grabbed his briefcase and hastily left the office, ignoring his secretary's calls. Throughout the journey back, His brain worked furiously. What should he do? Going to the police would mean losing Claire to the system, perhaps never seeing her again. But not going potentially meant hampering investigations into Darlene's whereabouts. When he arrived home, he found Claire curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow, while Mrs. Zelda tried unsuccessfully to convince her to eat something. "You came back," exclaimed the girl, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. But then, noticing his disturbed expression, her smile disappeared. Did something happen? Gerald looked at Mrs. Zelda, who understood the silent message and discreetly withdrew to the kitchen. "Claire," he began, sitting next to her on the couch, "I need you to tell me the truth about your mother." The girl instantly shrunk back, her eyes filling with fear. "I can't," she whispered. "He'll hurt her." "Oscar?" asked Gerald softly, noting how she shuddered at hearing the name. "Did he hurt your mother before?" Tears began to stream down Claire's face. "He beat her," she admitted in a low voice. "When he thought I was sleeping. But I heard everything." Gerald felt a wave of nausea imagining that child lying in her bed, hearing the sounds of violence coming from the other room. "On the last day," she continued, her voice trembling, "Mom said she was going to report him. That she had evidence, he got very angry. After that she disappeared." The weight of that revelation fell on Gerald like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just a case of abandonment, it was something much worse. And now he was in the middle of it all. "You need to be very brave now," he said, holding Claire's small hands between his. "We need to help your mother, but for that, we have to tell some people what happened." "No," she shouted, pulling her hands away and moving back. "He'll find us, he'll hurt her." "He won't," promised Gerald, although his heart was tight with worry. "I won't let him." But as he tried to calm Claire, a cruel doubt gnawed at him. How could he protect that child and her mother when he himself hadn't been able to protect his own family in the past? The sound of the TV in the kitchen caught his attention. Mrs. Zelda must be watching the news. The same report he had seen at the office was playing again. When Darlene's photo appeared on the screen, Claire, who had followed his gaze, let out a cry of recognition that broke his heart. "Mom!" she exclaimed, running to the TV. "It's Mom." And it was at that moment that Gerald realized there was no turning back. He could no longer pretend this was a temporary situation that would resolve itself. He needed to act. But each choice seemed laden with risks and possible devastating consequences. The weight of the decision Gerald needed to make seemed to crush his shoulders as he watched Claire sleeping on the couch, exhausted after crying for hours upon seeing her mother's image on television. Mrs. Zelda had stayed until later, preparing a calming tea for the girl and casting concerned looks in the direction of her former employer. "You know this is very serious, don't you?" she whispered before leaving, her tone maternal but firm as it had always been. "This child needs professional help." Gerald just nodded, unable to explain the complexity of the situation. After the housekeeper left, he remained seated in the armchair, observing the nocturnal city through the window, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. It was the sound of footsteps in the hallway that yanked him from his reflections. Claire had awakened and was now standing at the living room door, looking even smaller in her new pajamas, her eyes swollen from crying so much. "I can't sleep," she murmured, and there was something in her voice that made Gerald's heart tighten. "Come here," he called, and for the first time since he had found her, opened his arms in a silent invitation. Claire didn't hesitate. She ran to him and threw herself into his lap, burying her face in his chest. Gerald felt her tears soaking his shirt, and something inside him, something he had kept locked away for years, began to break. "I want my mom," she sobbed. "Why doesn't she come back?" The question echoed in the silent apartment, carrying with it all the weight of that child's pain. Gerald closed his eyes, involuntary memories invading his mind. Another childish cry, another impossible request to fulfill, another night when he felt completely powerless. "We'll find her," he promised, his voice hoarse. "But I need you to trust me. I need you to be very brave." Claire raised her face, her honey-colored eyes fixed on his. "You're afraid too," she said, with that frightening insight she sometimes demonstrated. I am, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. But sometimes we need to face our fear to do the right thing. That's when he made his decision. He couldn't continue hiding Claire, pretending everything would magically resolve itself. But he also couldn't simply hand her over to the authorities without guarantees. Tomorrow, he began carefully, I'm going to make some calls. I know people who can help us find your mother. What if Oscar finds us first? She asked, the fear evident in her voice. He won't find us, Gerald assured, although his heart beat faster just thinking about the possibility. This place is safe. No one gets in here without me knowing. But even as he said these words, a new worry began to corrode his mind. If Oscar had really done something to Darlene, if he discovered where Claire was. The sound of the phone cut through the silence like a knife, making them both jump. It was late for normal calls. Gerald picked up the cell phone with slightly shaking hands. The number was unknown. Don't answer it, pleaded Claire, clinging more tightly to him. Gerald hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. What if it was something about Darlene? What if it was a clue? The phone stopped ringing, only to start again seconds later. The same number. With a lump in his throat, he answered. Gerald Vance, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Silence on the other end, then heavy breathing. I know she's with you. The voice was deep, threatening. Gerald felt his blood freeze. Instinctively, he pressed Claire more tightly against himself. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied, although his heart was racing. A dry laugh echoed through the line. Don't play with me, Vance. I saw you two today entering your building. Nice place. It would be a shame if something happened. Gerald hung up the phone forcefully, his entire body trembling. Claire looked at him with eyes wide with dread. It was him, she whispered. It was Oscar. Panic threatened to overtake Gerald. How had that man found them? What did he want? Where was Darlene? We need to get out of here, he said, standing up with Claire still in his arms. Now. But where would they go? Who could help them without asking questions? And more importantly, how would he protect Claire from a man who seemed capable of anything? The sound of footsteps in the building's hallway made them both freeze. Someone was standing in front of his door. The silence that followed was deafening. Then a knock. Strong. Determined. Claire began to tremble violently in his arms, and Gerald felt a fear he hadn't experienced since the night of the accident with his daughter. But this time would be different. This time he wouldn't fail to protect someone who depended on him. With his heart pounding in his chest, he put Claire on the floor and whispered, Go to my room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Don't leave me, she begged, clinging to his leg. Everything will be fine, he promised, praying he wasn't lying. I'll protect you. As he watched Claire run down the hallway, Gerald faced the living room door, where the knocking continued, growing louder. Whatever was on the other side, he was about to find out, and this time he wouldn't run from the confrontation. The knocking on the door suddenly ceased, leaving an even more terrifying silence in its place. Gerald remained motionless, his heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. Years of tense meetings and difficult negotiations hadn't prepared him for this moment. Mr. Vance? A female voice called from the other side of the door. Please, I need to speak with you. It's about Darlene Stevens. Gerald felt his stomach sink. It wasn't Oscar, but that didn't mean he was safe. He approached the door cautiously, making no noise. Who are you? My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm a social worker from St. Clair Hospital in Riverside. There was a pause. We found Darlene 3 days ago. Gerald's heart stopped for a moment. Darlene was alive, in Riverside. How had she gotten so far? Still hesitant, he peered through the peephole. On the other side, a middle-aged woman with grey hair and a tired expression held a badge against the glass. It looked legitimate. With trembling fingers, Gerald opened the door, keeping the security chain in place. How did you find me? Rebecca sighed deeply. Darlene recovered part of her memory yesterday. She managed to tell us her daughter's name, and when we checked the recent news, she made a significant pause. Someone saw you with Claire today. The photo is circulating in search groups. Gerald felt an icy shiver run down his spine. So, that's how Oscar had found them. "Prove that you really work at the hospital," he demanded, still keeping the door half closed. Rebecca rummaged in her bag and pulled out some documents. "Here's my professional registration, the hospital documentation, and," she hesitated, "a recent photo of Darlene." Gerald took the papers through the crack in the door, examining them thoroughly. Everything seemed authentic. The photo showed Darlene in a hospital bed, thinner, pale, but undoubtedly alive. "How is she?" "Stable now," replied Rebecca. "But we need your help, Mr. Vance. Darlene is devastated, thinking she lost her daughter. She doesn't remember much, but she knows that Oscar—" Her voice failed. "Well, she has reasons to fear for Claire." At that moment, a noise from the hallway caught Gerald's attention. Claire was standing there, her wide eyes fixed on the photo he was holding. "Mom," she whispered, and began to cry. Rebecca, hearing the girl's voice, leaned to try to see her through the crack in the door. "Claire, sweetheart, your mother is waiting for you. She's fine, she's safe." But the girl backed away, the fear evident on her face. "How do I know it's not a lie? How do I know Oscar didn't send you?" The question, so adult coming from such a small child, made Gerald's heart ache. Rebecca, in turn, seemed to perfectly understand the girl's fear. "Your mother told me about your special teddy bear," she said softly. "The one with the blue patch on the left ear that you got on your 5th birthday." Claire gasped in surprise. It was a detail she hadn't shared with anyone, not even with Gerald. "And she also told me," continued Rebecca, "about the song she sang to you at bedtime, the one about the little bird that built its nest in the rain." Thick tears began to stream down Claire's face. "Only Mom knows that song," she whispered. Gerald felt something break inside him. It was time to let Claire go, to return her to her mother, to her true life. But why did the idea hurt so much? "I can take you to her now," offered Rebecca. "There's a car waiting downstairs with police escort." "Police?" asked Gerald, alarmed. "Yes," Rebecca nodded gravely. "Oscar has been seen in the city. We can't risk it." Fear tightened Gerald's chest again. He looked at Claire, who had approached and held his hand. "Will you come with me?" she asked, her eyes pleading. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. How could he leave her now? "Mr. Vance," interrupted Rebecca, her tone changing subtly. "I need to warn you. You may face legal problems for having kept Claire here without notifying the authorities." Gerald closed his eyes for a moment. Of course, there would be consequences. He had known this since the first day, from the moment he decided to take that frightened girl to his home instead of calling the police. "I know," he said simply. "No," shouted Claire, clutching his leg. "I don't want you to get hurt. You only helped me." "It's all right," he tried to calm her, although his own heart was heavy. "The important thing is that you'll be with your mother." Rebecca observed the scene with a complex expression. "We have to go," she said softly. "It's not safe to stay here." Gerald nodded and began to move quickly around the apartment, taking only the essentials. While helping Claire put some clothes in a small backpack, he couldn't stop thinking about how his life had completely changed in just a week. But before they could leave, the phone rang again. The same unknown number. Gerald's blood froze in his veins. Beside him, Claire began to tremble. Rebecca, sensing the change in atmosphere, approached the window and made a signal to someone down below. "We have to go. Now." But when they opened the apartment door, the hallway was completely dark. The lights had been turned off. And in the sepulchral silence that followed, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps climbing the emergency staircase. Panic took over the dark hallway like an icy wave. Rebecca quickly pulled Claire behind her, while Gerald silently closed the apartment door, locking it. "Is there another exit?" whispered Rebecca, her professional voice now tinged with fear. Gerald nodded, his brain working furiously. "The garage. There's a service staircase that leads directly there." The footsteps on the emergency staircase were getting closer. Claire clutched Gerald's hand so tightly that her small nails left marks on his skin. "This way," he murmured, guiding them through the kitchen to a discreet door that led to the service area. They had barely closed that door when they heard the distinctive sound of someone forcing the lock of the main entrance. Rebecca covered Claire's mouth with her hand, muffling a frightened sob. The descent down the service staircase seemed endless. Each step echoed dangerously. Each breath sounded too loud. Gerald carried Claire in his arms, trying to minimize the noise. It was when they were on the third floor that they heard the apartment door being broken into upstairs. "Faster," whispered Rebecca, although they were already moving as silently as possible. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the stairwell, coming from above. He was following the same path they were. They finally reached the garage, a large, poorly lit space full of covered cars and threatening shadows. Rebecca immediately took out her cell phone. "The police are on their way," she informed in a low voice. "We need to get to the street." But before they could move, a deep voice reverberated through the garage. What a touching scene. Oscar emerged from the shadows between two concrete columns. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Gerald instinctively placed Claire behind him. The girl was trembling violently but didn't make a sound. "It's over, Oscar," said Rebecca, her voice firm despite the evident fear. "Darlene is alive. She told everything." Oscar's smile faltered for a moment but soon returned, even more sinister. "That bitch should have stayed quiet. Now I'll have to fix that too." "Why?" asked Gerald, trying to buy time, knowing that the police were on their way. "Why do all this?" Oscar let out a bitter laugh. "You wouldn't understand, Vance, a rich man like you living in your privileged little world. Do you know how much money Darlene had saved? Her first husband's life insurance." He took a step forward, but the idiot started asking questions, started threatening to report me as if she were somebody. "You hurt her," Claire's small voice sounded from behind Gerald. "You're bad." "Shut up, brat," vociferated Oscar, his face contorting into a mask of hatred. "If it weren't for you, your mother would have been smarter, would have stayed quiet." Gerald felt a wave of fury take over his body. How could someone be so cruel to a child? The memories of his own daughter, of the accident, of his impotence in the face of tragedy, all mixed in his chest. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even himself. "You won't hurt anyone else." Oscar laughed again, a harsh and threatening sound. "And who's going to stop me? You?" It was at that moment that sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly approaching. Oscar's smile disappeared. "No one will believe you," he growled, now visibly nervous. "I'll say you kidnapped the girl, that you're a perverted old man who—" "Recording everything," interrupted Rebecca, her cell phone raised. "Every word of yours." Oscar's face contorted into an expression of pure fury. With an animal roar, he rushed toward them. Gerald didn't think, he acted. He pushed Claire and Rebecca behind a pillar and placed himself in Oscar's path. The impact of the larger body against his was like being hit by a train, but he stood firm. The two men fell to the garage floor fighting. Oscar was stronger, younger, more violent. His fists found Gerald's face once, twice. But Gerald didn't feel the pain. All he could think about was Claire, his daughter whom he couldn't protect, all the children who suffered at the hands of monsters like that one. The sirens were very close now. Oscar, realizing he was cornered, tried to get up to flee. That was his mistake. Gerald grabbed his legs, knocking him down again. The sound of Oscar's head hitting the concrete echoed through the garage. "Police, freeze!" Lights invaded the space. Authoritative voices shouted commands. Gerald felt hands pulling him away from Oscar, who lay motionless on the floor. "Gerald!" Claire's cry brought him back to reality. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. As the police handcuffed Oscar, who was beginning to recover, Rebecca approached them, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "We need to go," she said softly. "Darlene is waiting." Gerald nodded, feeling the adrenaline beginning to recede, replaced by a sharp pain in his face and a deep tiredness in his bones. But when he tried to stand up, a sudden dizziness hit him. The world spun, darkened at the edges. The last thing he heard was Claire's frightened cry calling his name before everything plunged into darkness. The characteristic smell of hospital was the first thing Gerald noticed when he began to wake up. His eyes opened slowly, adapting to the fluorescent light in the room. His entire body ached and his head throbbed as if it had been hit by a hammer. "He's awake!" a familiar childish voice shouted, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. When his vision finally came into focus, Gerald saw Claire beside his bed, her honey-colored eyes wide with concern. A nurse soon appeared, checking his vital signs. "You gave us quite a scare," she said, adjusting the IV in his arm. "You had a serious concussion, besides some cracked ribs." Gerald tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness made him give up. "How long?" "2 days," replied Claire, carefully holding his hand so as not to disturb the medical equipment. "You slept a lot." There was something different about her, a sparkle in her eyes, a lightness he had never seen before. It was then that he noticed another presence in the room. A woman was standing near the window, the same honey-colored eyes as Claire, though marked by deep, dark circles and concern. Darlene Stevens was thinner than in the photo Rebecca had shown, but there was a silent strength in her posture. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice choked, "how can I thank you?" "Mom cried a lot when I told her everything you did for me," interrupted Claire, her voice animated despite the circumstances. "And Rebecca said you were very brave in the garage." Gerald tried to smile, but his injured face protested. "Oscar?" "Arrested," replied Darlene, her face hardening at the mention of the name. "The police found evidence, a lot of evidence. He won't hurt anyone anymore." A heavy silence fell over the room. There was so much to be said, so many questions to be asked. Gerald looked at Darlene, recognizing in her the same strength he had seen in Claire, the ability to survive, to move forward despite everything. "I'm sorry," he finally said, "for not seeking the authorities sooner. I should have—" "No," interrupted Darlene, approaching the bed. "You protected my daughter when I couldn't, gave her security, affection." Her voice failed. "Rebecca told me how you met, how you took her in. Many would have ignored a child alone on the street." Claire squeezed Gerald's hand a little tighter. "He made pancakes for me, Mom, and gave me new clothes and a warm place to sleep." Tears began to stream down Darlene's face. "When Oscar attacked me that night, when I woke up in the hospital with no memory, no documents, my biggest fear was what had happened to Claire. If he had—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He never found me," said Claire proudly. "I was smart, like you always told me to. And then Gerald found me." The nurse returned at that moment, carrying a tray with medications. "I'm sorry, but the patient needs to rest now." "No," protested Claire, clinging more tightly to Gerald's hand. "I don't want to go, darling." Darlene approached gently. "Gerald needs to recover. We can come back tomorrow." But Gerald could see the fear in the girl's eyes, the same fear of abandonment she had carried since the first day. "It's okay," he said, ignoring the pain in his face as he smiled. "I promise I'm not going anywhere." "Do you really promise?" she asked, her eyes shining with contained tears. "I promise." Darlene picked up her daughter, and Gerald noticed how the two fit together perfectly, as if they had never been separated. "Let's let him rest," she said softly. "After all, we need to prepare. That surprise we talked about, remember?" Claire's eyes instantly lit up. "That's right, but don't tell him, it's a secret." Gerald watched the two leave the room, his heart a confused mixture of joy and melancholy. This is how it should be. Mother and daughter together again. So why did he feel like he was losing something precious? The nurse finished administering the medications and adjusted his pillow. "You know," she said with a gentle smile, "that little girl didn't leave your side for a minute during these 2 days. We only managed to convince her to eat because her mother arrived." Gerald closed his eyes, feeling fatigue weigh on him again. But before falling asleep, his mind wandered to the locked door in his apartment, the room that kept his own daughter's memories. Perhaps, he thought as sleep enveloped him, it was time to open that door again. After all, sometimes fate had strange ways of healing old wounds. 3 days passed before the doctors allowed Gerald to be discharged from the hospital. During this time, Claire and Darlene visited him every day, bringing drawings, stories, and an energy that made the sterile hospital room seem more alive. Rebecca also appeared occasionally, always with news about Oscar's case and documents for Gerald to sign. "The judge was very understanding of your situation," she explained during one of these visits. "Considering the circumstances and Darlene's testimony, there will be no charges against you for having sheltered Claire." Gerald just nodded, his relief more related to Claire's well-being than to his own legal concerns. The girl was flourishing. Under her mother's care, her smile more frequent, her eyes brighter. On the morning of his discharge, Gerald found Mrs. Zelda waiting for him at the hospital reception. The former housekeeper had taken care of his apartment during his hospitalization, and something in her look said she had news. "You're going to have a surprise when you get home," she said with a mysterious smile. The journey back was silent. Gerald lost in thoughts about how it would be to return to his solitary life. The apartment would seem even larger now, even emptier without Claire's presence. But when the door opened, he was greeted by a sight that made his heart stop. The door of the room that had remained locked for years was open. "No," he murmured, feeling his legs weaken. "Surprise!" a familiar voice shouted, and Claire came running from the room, followed by Darlene. The room, which had been an untouched sanctuary of his daughter's memories, was transformed. The walls, previously a faded pink, were now painted in a soft shade of blue. His daughter's toys and personal belongings had been carefully organized on shelves, like in a small museum of precious memories. "Rebecca said you kept Maria's things." "Here," said Claire softly, taking his hand. "She was your daughter, wasn't she?" Gerald couldn't answer, his throat closed with emotion. How had they discovered? How had they dared to enter that sacred space? "It was Claire's idea," explained Darlene, noticing his discomfort. "She said you needed a place to remember, but that you also needed to move forward." "Look!" Claire pulled him into the room, pointing to one of the shelves. There, next to an old doll that had belonged to his daughter, was a new drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one medium, and one small. "It's us," she explained proudly. "You, Mum, and me. Because now we're a family too, aren't we?" The tears Gerald had held back for so many years finally began to fall. Memories of Maria, his little Maria, playing in that same room, laughing, calling for him. But now, for the first time, these memories didn't bring just pain. "Maria would have liked you," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I know," replied Claire with that inexplicable wisdom she sometimes demonstrated. "That's why I put the drawing here, so she'll never be alone." Darlene approached, her eyes also wet. "I know it's a lot to process," she said softly, "but we wanted you to know that you're not alone anymore. If you want, of course." Gerald looked around the room, at his daughter's memories now intertwined with the new life he had unexpectedly found. The weight in his chest, which he had carried for so many years, began to transform into something different, something that felt very much like hope. "We bought an apartment nearby," continued Darlene. "Just 2 blocks from here. Claire insisted it needed to be close enough for her to come have breakfast with you on weekends. And you're going to teach me how to make pancakes properly," added Claire, jumping with excitement. "And we can watch movies together, and you can take me to school sometimes and—" Claire interrupted Darlene gently. "Remember what we talked about giving Gerald space to decide." But Gerald had already decided. In fact, he had decided the moment. He saw that girl alone on the sidewalk holding a piece of paper with the word birthday on it. "I would love that," he said, and for the first time in years his smile reached his eyes. Mrs. Zelda, who was observing the scene from the door, discreetly wiped away a tear. "I'll prepare some coffee to celebrate," she announced, heading to the kitchen. While Claire ran after the housekeeper, probably to ask for her favorite cookies, Darlene remained beside Gerald, both contemplating the transformed room. "She saved me too, you know," said Darlene softly. "When I woke up in that hospital with no memory, nothing, it was the memory of her that kept me fighting. And now, She paused, choosing her words. "Now we have you too." Gerald nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. Sometimes, he thought, we need to completely lose ourselves to find our way back home. And sometimes that path leads us to places we never imagined existed. The months that followed brought changes that Gerald would never have imagined possible in his life. The apartment, once so silent and cold, now frequently filled with the sound of childish laughter and animated conversations. Sunday mornings, which he used to spend alone with his coffee and newspaper, transformed into precious moments of pancake preparation with Claire, who insisted on supervising each step of the process. Darlene had secured a job at a nearby school as a teaching assistant and was gradually rebuilding her life, now free from the shadows of the past. Oscar's trial was scheduled for the next month, and although the prospect of seeing him again still frightened her, she found strength in Gerald's support and in her daughter's renewed joy. On a particularly significant afternoon, Gerald was in his office when Claire burst through the door carrying a sheet of paper. "Look what I made at school," she exclaimed, extending the drawing to him. It was a family tree, a common school assignment, but what caught Gerald's attention was how she had organized the names. At the top was Darlene, connected to Claire by a firm line. And beside them, linked by a dashed line she had created herself, was his name. "The teacher said family isn't just who has the same blood," she explained, anxiously observing his reaction. "So I put you too, is that okay?" Gerald felt his vision blur with contained tears. "Of course it's okay," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And look," she continued, pointing to a small angel she had drawn in the upper corner of the paper. "That's Maria. She's family too, even though she's not here." It was too much for Gerald. The tears began to fall freely, and he pulled Claire into a tight embrace. The girl returned with the same intensity, as if she perfectly understood the significance of that moment. "You still miss her, don't you?" she asked softly. "Every day," he admitted, "but now it hurts a little less." Claire nodded solemnly. "Mom says we never stop missing people we love. We just learn to carry the love in a different way." Gerald was surprised once again by the wisdom that child demonstrated. It was as if she had lived several lives in her few years of existence. "You know," she continued, playing with the hem of her blouse as she did when nervous, "sometimes I dream about Maria. She's smiling and says she's happy because you're not alone anymore." Gerald's heart stopped for a moment. He had never told Claire what Maria's smile was like, had never shown photos of her smiling. How do you know she smiled like that?" "I just know," Claire shrugged. "In the dream, she has the same smile you make when you're really happy, the one that almost never appeared before, but now appears more." At that moment, Darlene appeared at the office door, probably attracted by the voices. Seeing the tears on Gerald's face and the drawing in Claire's hands, she seemed to immediately understand what was happening. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Gerald nodded, wiping his eyes. "Better than okay," he replied, and realized it was true. "Mom," called Claire, "can we hang the drawing in Maria's room so she can always see that we remember her?" Darlene looked at Gerald, waiting for his approval. He thought for a moment about the room that had now become a space of healing instead of a memorial of pain. "It's a great idea," he finally said. As he watched Claire run to get adhesive tape, Gerald reflected on how life could be surprising. A year ago, he was immersed in his solitude, carrying the weight of a loss that seemed impossible to overcome. Now, through the love of a child fate had placed in his path, he was learning to live again. "She has that gift, doesn't she?" commented Darlene, sitting beside him, "of healing wounded hearts." "She does," he agreed. "But I think it's not just her, it's all this." He made a vague gesture with his hand, searching for the right word. "Love?" suggested Darlene with a soft smile. "Yes," he admitted, "all this love that somehow found its way back into my life." Claire returned with the adhesive tape and an absolute determination to find the perfect place for her drawing. As he watched her work, Gerald thought about how the greatest miracles sometimes came disguised in the most unexpected forms. "Done," she finally announced, admiring her work. Now it really looks like a real family. And looking at that simple drawing made with the pure love of a child, Gerald couldn't agree more. It was a real family, not in the way he had imagined, not in the way he had planned, but exactly in the way it needed to be. The Sunday morning sun filtered softly through the living room curtains, creating golden patterns on the marble floor. Gerald was in the kitchen, preparing pancake batter with the precision of someone who had transformed this ritual into an art over the past year. The sweet aroma of vanilla and cinnamon filled the apartment, mixing with the sound of laughter, coming from the room that had once been merely a sanctuary of painful memories. It was a special day, Claire's 7th birthday. Darlene had insisted on having the party at Gerald's apartment, arguing that it was there that everything had begun, on that afternoon when a lonely girl with a piece of paper met a man who also carried his own loneliness. "Is it almost ready?" asked Claire, appearing in the kitchen with a new dress and a radiant smile. "The guests are about to arrive." "Almost," he replied, flipping another pancake with perfection. "But I thought you wanted a birthday cake, not pancakes." "Both," she declared with conviction. "It's my birthday, I can have both, can't I?" Gerald laughed, a sound that had become much more frequent in his life. "Of course you can," he agreed, placing the last pancake on a plate specially decorated for the occasion. Darlene entered the kitchen, carrying a carefully wrapped box. "I found this in my old belongings," she said, placing the package on the counter. "I was saving it for today." Claire opened the present with reverent care, and her eyes filled with tears when she saw what was inside. Her old teddy bear, the one with the blue patch on the left ear. "I thought I'd lost him forever," she whispered, hugging the stuffed animal against her chest. "Rebecca found it among the things that were recovered from our old house," explained Darlene. "She kept it for me when I was in the hospital." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the emotional moment. Soon, the apartment began to fill with guests, Claire's school friends, some teachers, Rebecca, Mrs. Zelda, and even some executives from Gerald's company who had become close friends over the past year. As he watched the party unfold, Gerald couldn't help but notice how his apartment had changed. The once austere walls now displayed colorful drawings and photographs of happy moments. The expensive furniture that before served only as decoration now showed signs of use and life. Even Maria's room, which for so long had been a temple of pain, was now a space of sweet memories and new joys. "What are you thinking about?" asked Darlene, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "About how life is unpredictable," he replied, accepting one of the cups. "A year ago, if someone had told me that my apartment would be like this, full of children and joy, you wouldn't believe it," she completed with an understanding smile. "Not just that," he continued, watching Claire play with her friends. "I wouldn't believe I could be happy again, that I could love again." Darlene placed her hand over his, a gesture that had become natural over the months. "Sometimes we need to completely lose ourselves to find our true path home." At that moment, Claire ran up to them, her eyes shining with excitement. "Cake time," she announced. "But first I want to make a special request." "Besides your birthday wishes?" joked Gerald. "Yes," she nodded energetically. "I want us to take a photo, the 3 of us in front of Maria's room, so she can see that we're all happy now." Gerald felt his heart tighten, but in a different way, no longer with pain, but with a deep gratitude for this second chance life had given him. Everyone gathered for the photo. Claire in the middle, Darlene and Gerald at her side, the teddy bear with the blue patch secure in her arms. And there, in that moment frozen in time, something completed itself. Later, when the guests had already left and Claire was sleeping, hugging her recovered teddy bear, Gerald and Darlene sat on the balcony, contemplating the city that never slept. "You know," he said softly, "for a long time I thought some losses were impossible to overcome, that some pains never healed. And now?" she asked. "Now I understand that life has its own way of healing, not by erasing the scars, but by teaching us to carry the love in a different way, as you always say." Darlene smiled, leaning back against his shoulder. "Claire taught me that, too, that sometimes we need to lose everything to find something even more precious The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with all the words that didn't need to be said. Inside, the newly taken photo already occupied its place on Maria's room wall, next to Claire's family tree drawing. And that night, as the city continued its eternal dance of lights and shadows, three once wounded hearts beat in harmony, united by a love that had found its way through pain, loss, and redemption. Because sometimes, the happiest endings aren't those we plan, but those that life gently places in our path, disguised as moments of deep sadness, waiting only for us to have the courage to open our hearts once more.